There are 7 killer traps you face in managing assets. Are you primarily being compensated as an asset gatherer or as an asset manager? Because these are two very, very different roles, and you need to understand or determine who you truly want to be. So let's talk about the biggest traps if you're playing asset manager.
This is The Rare Advisor, proud to be a part of the Advisor Advancement Network and home of a business model supercharged by recurring and repeatable events. Your host is Mike Walters, CEO of USA Financial. He is an investment advisor representative of, and securities are offered through USA Financial Securities, member FINRA SIPC, a registered investment advisor.
Hey, welcome back to The Rare Advisor. Today we're going to have a special discussion about the 7 killer traps that you face in managing assets. Now stop and be careful about what I just talked about. Managing assets, very different role than gathering assets. So the question is, are you primarily being compensated as an asset gatherer or as an asset manager? Because these are two very different roles, very, very different roles. And it's important to determine what you truly want to be inside of your advisory practice. So let's talk about the biggest traps if you're playing asset manager. Now, first off, there is nothing inherently wrong with you being the manager of the assets. Now again, not to be confused with managing the portfolio, with assembling other asset managers within the portfolio to play their role for the different types of asset classes and the different types of things you're trying to accomplish. I'm talking about you physically managing the assets, buying, selling, trading within the models, within the portfolios. You definitely need to know the pitfalls and avoid them if you're going to physically manage those assets. So let's talk about the 7 traps, so to speak. Number 1, if the portfolio is performing poorly and you are the asset manager, now you are the only one left to be fired by the client. Meaning that an asset gatherer, generally speaking, is going to manage the overall portfolio and the asset managers that they've assembled to drive that portfolio. The asset gatherer will manage the asset managers. It will hire and fire them accordingly and remove them from the portfolio if and when it's necessary. An asset manager does not have that choice. An asset manager loses that option. They are the only one who can now be removed and or fired from that client and from that portfolio. So be very careful about how you're positioned with your clients as a gatherer and an overall manager of the portfolio versus being an asset manager or a money manager within that portfolio. Number 2, you are generally most financially rewarded in the role of asset gathering. You're there to gather the assets, to bring new clients to the firm, to grow the practice. Gathering assets and managing assets, as I mentioned, two very different skill sets. Very seldom is the same person going to be good at both of those. It happens, but very, very seldom. Most advisors are wired to gather assets. They've got that outgoing personality. They're good at bringing people into the firm, bringing new clients and new assets into the firm, as opposed to camping out in front of the computer screen, managing those assets and determining what needs to be bought, held, sold, and so on within the models, within the portfolios, within the holdings of those portfolios. By definition, keep in mind, by definition, a rainmaker is always going to be, at the financial advisory practice, is always going to be an asset gatherer, never an asset manager. The rainmaker is the asset gatherer, the one who brings clients to the firm. Think about that. Even in a law firm, the rainmaker in a law firm is there to bring in clientele, not to run court cases. The rainmaker in advisory practice is designed to bring clientele in, asset gathering, rather than asset managing. Very important distinction. Number 3, if you are managing assets, you're limiting your time to be able to now gather assets. And again, if you're the rainmaker, if that's your job, then the more you end up growing the practice, the more time you have to spend managing assets and the less time you have to be a rainmaker to actually be out there gathering those assets. So the more successful you are, the more time it requires to do the things that do not make you so successful. So again, it's like these dynamics are working against each other. The more successful I become as an asset gatherer, as a rainmaker, the more time I need to spend as an asset manager, and now the less time I have to actually grow the business by gathering new assets. So it's very, very important you be very careful about how you disseminate your time between these two disciplines. So number 4, managing assets can dwarf your scalability. Many investors, buyers, even next-gen advisors within your practice, they do not want to buy your job. They don't want to climb inside your head and try to figure out how you're doing all that buying, trading, selling, managing of assets within the portfolio. Now, they might be very interested in buying your practice from you down the road today, whenever the transition period succession is important. They might be very interested in sitting in that role, but they do not want to get chained to the desk and manage those assets. Not as a buyer, not as an investor, and generally not as a next-gen advisor coming up through the ranks if you're doing an internal transition. So be very careful that you're not dwarfing your scalability, because again, I talk about that part in terms of kind of the ongoing valuation of your practice, but the flip side is also true. The reason that scalability is also true for an outsider or for a next gen is also true for you. Meaning, again, if I'm using outside asset management, if I'm assembling the managers within the portfolio, I have scalability. It doesn't really matter how big this thing becomes. Managing those assets, those asset managers, I should say, it doesn't change. But the bigger you become, if you're managing assets, the more time you have to invest in physically managing those assets. So again, understand scalability and how it fits into this equation. Number 5, many clients and also prospects do not believe and never will believe that you can manage assets alongside the best of them. They're going to measure you. The measuring stick you're subjecting yourself to is national when you're talking about asset managers. It's local when you're talking about asset gatherers. That's a very important distinction, because if you were good at managing assets, they're going to wonder, why are you still living here in our small town or our mid-sized town or our area or region in the Midwest or the Southeast or the Northeast or Northwest, I should say. And so why aren't you in New York City, right? If you were good at managing assets, why is your office not bigger? If you were good at managing assets, why is your staff not bigger? If you were good at managing assets, how in the world would you have the kind of time necessary to spend with me managing the relationship, managing my overall portfolio and my financial plan? These questions go through someone's mind. Doesn't mean you can't overcome them, but you better have good answers, because even if they don't voice them, they are thinking them. And that kind of leads to number 6. Number 6, clients' adult children will almost always pit themselves against you as the local asset manager, the local person managing assets, not gathering assets, managing assets. Because again, the adult children, they're even more so than their clients, because they're much more digitally oriented. They are going to think nationally about management of assets, not locally. Again, the adult children will generally believe a national large institution asset manager will be able to manage assets better than you sitting in Podunk, better than you in the local environment, better than you in a small office supporting their parents. Now, number 7, clients and their adult children will judge you on your managed assets rather than the quality of the plans that you're creating for them. Again, asset gatherers are creating financial plans. Asset managers are investment managers. They're making these investments inside the portfolio. So how do you want to be compared or judged? The greatest asset managers around the country nationally being compared and judged and measured against you, or other asset gatherers, other planners inside of your city, your geography, your bubble, if you will. Now, at the very least, you have to be realistic and understand the measuring stick you're being put up against, right? So again, there's nothing inherently wrong with managing assets. And I know many of you are probably quite good at it. but you definitely have to know the pitfalls and how to avoid them and have answers for these 7 items that I've talked about if you truly want to manage assets. Now, if you're on the fence about this, then what I would say is you shouldn't be managing assets because of all the 7 reasons I just talked about. That's a great reason to use third-party asset management. And there are statistics out there and studies in the industry always talking about, 95%, 98% of asset managers who go back to just being asset gatherers are happy they did it. They're happy they're using third-party asset management so that they can now go do what they're supposed to do, what they get paid to do, what they're supposed to fill the shoes as the rainmaker in their practice. This allows them to then go do that. So again, we all are wired differently. God wired us all different ways. Maybe you are supposed to be an asset manager. But if that's the case, think of these 7 items and how you want to position and handle those. If you're an asset gatherer, think the flip side. If you're running against competition of someone who's playing asset management and you're sitting down with their client, the reason they're sitting down with you is because they're thinking about firing that asset manager. And these are the wedges that then come up that you might want to push those buttons and apply a little pressure in these areas because the consumer tends to be thinking the way I just shared with you. Again, important stuff. Think about how you want to be positioned.
This information is for licensed financial professionals only and is not intended for use in soliciting sales from the public. The views expressed represent the opinions of the presenter or their featured guest, not necessarily those of USA Financial or its affiliated subsidiaries. Industry references are generic and not intended to represent actions or beliefs of any individual or entity. Content is only presented to illustrate general principles, beliefs, or ideas and should not be construed as legal or regulatory advice. Trademark and copyright protected. USA Financial and Affiliates.